session for FA255, Understanding Movies, the American Cinema. It's almost over, just a couple of weeks left, and then we can all go home and we can all take a breath. So let's find out what the final is going to be all about. So let's take a look and let's get right on to it. And as I mentioned before, 1 week only. The final exam will be 1 week only. It starts this Thursday, June 5th, and it'll run through June 12th. The following Thursday, it is as the midterm was. It's in the social science testing lab, and it closes Thursday. And I don't know the hours, but I'm positive it closes at 5 o'clock. Now I don't know that for absolute sure, but always in the past it closes early on Thursdays, so of finals week. So again, remember, check their hours. And let's see, no makeup exams, whatever. And we've got, again, check Saturday hours. I'm sure they have the Saturday hours, but I don't think it's going to be quite the massive influx of students as it had been in the past. But it's always good to get the exam, out of the way. So think about Saturday and just get it out of your system. And what else do we have? Same thing as the midterm. We have 50 questions, objective exam again. That means there are no written questions, so it's pretty much just similar to what you took in the midterm. Now, the study guides are now available on Moodle for downloading. If you haven't been there yet, I urge you. It's a little bit different from the midterm study guide, and I think you'll really, really, really like this one. So, a word to the wise, check the study guide and smile. Okay, and again, it's still in the same place, the testing lab. I had two individuals, and I'm scratching my head about this. I had two individuals email me around midterm time wanting to get passwords so they could take the midterm at home. And I don't know what you're talking about. We've never talked about having a midterm at home and never talked about having passwords or anything. The exam is administered in the social science testing lab. That's Center Building 456. Okay, remember that you need to take photo ID, and you're still allowed one 3x5 note card. And again, as I just emphasize this over and over and over again, because it's a word to the wise, is to check and verify the hours of the testing lab so that you don't find yourself being kicked out because you got there 5 minutes before closing time. Okay, as you know, extra credit is an option for you. And if you are turning in extra credit, it is due. The last day for me to get it is June 10th. That is 1 week from tomorrow. I will not read anything that comes in after that, so make sure and have it ready for me by June 10th. If you're doing hard copy, and I don't think too many people do it anymore, but just in case you are, it must be postmarked no later than June 6th. All right, now what's on the exam? All right, it's going to cover everything since the midterm. So that means we're going to look at everything under the combat film up through the edge of Hollywood, which is the final week, this week, and everything in between. So let's take a look at all of that. So the first thing is, what should you know about the combat war film? Well, the features of this genre, there are three of them. Laws and morality get suspended. All right, in that regard, it's kind of a free-for-all. It's if you're gonna win, you fight to win at all costs. Secondly, there is a switch from the individual to the group. In other words, to the troops. It's very sacrificial here. You're sacrificing for the betterment of the group, which is just the opposite of what the Western was doing. The Western was all about rugged individualism and the role of the individual, but with war, it is the switch from that individual to the group. And it's interesting that the icon, as they like to say in this day and age, the image, the figure that represents Hollywood's Western and Hollywood's war film is the same guy, John Wayne. And number 3, women are seen as emotional, or are the emotional element, and that brings out male vulnerability. So those are the features of this particular genre, the combat and war film. The combat and war film also presents us with anti-war sentiments and post-war films. That is, during the war, we have very much a pro-war stance. We're in it to win. We're in it and we support the troops, that kind of attitude. But after the war is over and the troops come home, we have what they call the post-war films, and it takes on a little different approach to what war is all about, and it becomes almost, well, I guess it is, for lack of a better term, anti-war, but not in the sense of what we think of with regard to Vietnam. But it takes on the sentiments of really, who wants to go to war? Absolutely nobody. And the first person who doesn't want to go to war is the soldier. And in these particular films, we see why and what happens to soldiers when they return from war. And also we get war films and their portrayal of racial integration of the armed forces. You know, they are segregated until 1948 when Truman integrates the armed forces. So in the post-war films, we take a look at that issue. All right, moving on. The combat war film also tells us that the fundamental American philosophy or ideology is this: we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. So the attitude here for those films, when we see American war films, is pretty much that. We may lose a battle here and there, but we're always right. Okay, also discussed at this time is the significance of the government here with the Office of War Information, the role of the U.S. government in Hollywood film production. Essentially, propaganda, that's all it is. Propaganda films made for the home front, that with the idea of shaping public opinion. In other words, what we need is, it's regarding the group again, what we need is the shaping of support. Other than that, why bother to fight? And also the Office of War Information presented us the propaganda in what is known as the Sergeant York formula. In this regard, it depicts the conversion of an objector to the war, someone who is opposed to all fighting in some cases, to a supporter of the war, who's someone who through some kind of epiphany, if we can say that, ends up saying that it is very important that we go to war. The Sergeant York formula was based on actually they made the film with Gary Cooper at that time, but it was based on an actual individual, Sergeant York in World War I, who was a conscientious objector but ended up fighting and became a supporter. John Wayne used that attitude, used that philosophy, used that image, milieu, whatever you want to say, the formula here, for the Green Berets in 1968. An interesting film in the middle of Vietnam, in which that film is surrounded by other films which are totally anti-war, and John Wayne makes the effort here by using what he knew best, which comes out of the World War II. Okay, moving on, we go to film noir. The question is asked in our film series. It's one that is still asked today. Is film noir a true genre? I don't think there is an answer to that because there's just as much support for claiming that it is a genre as there is for attacking it and saying, no, it's just a style. But nonetheless, it is a French word that means black film. And the reason that it is referred to as black film is because it is always, for the most part, is always shot at night. Film noir is adaptations of American pulp fiction and hard-boiled novels, very popular at the time in the 30s and the 40s. But this whole idea of black film or film noir is discovered, these films are discovered. In other words, they weren't making film noir as such. That is, they did not have the term. They were just making films, but it took critics in France who discovered a whole bunch of these films that had the same look, the themes and so forth that we'll look at, and then described them and called them film noir. So that's what we have here. An interesting way of looking at genre is that, you know, the filmmakers make films and they do it this way, and one film always leads to another. And what you have when it's over and done with is you have a genre that someone else discovers, someone outside of the country. So what is it that they discovered? What is it that they said makes these films, constitutes these films? Well, first of all, the settings. As I mentioned before, it became film noir because the settings are very much at night. They're the urban, they're in the middle of the city. Excuse me. They are not wide open spaces. They're nowhere near what a Western would give us. They are shot in the urban settings and usually with rain-slick streets. Excuse me. And it's usually not the best part of town either. It's the sleazy side of city life where you run into interesting characters. Character types like amnesiacs. You find anti-social loners. And you have a new kind of hero, the private detective, who comes again out of crime fiction, out of the hard-boiled detective. These are not police officials, but they are individuals, private detectives, who involve themselves in a certain kind of perverse morality. That is, they are not opposed themselves to breaking laws in order to bring justice to victims. The themes that we find in film noir are essentially two. The alienation of all the characters. They are alienated from society. In some cases, they're shunned. And the existentialism that surrounds the milieu, that there is no exit out of the city. There is no exit out of that sleazy side of existence. And actually, when it's over and done with, there is no exit out of the situation. You're just trapped. And the style. This is what caught the French critics, caught their attention, is these films had a very specific look to them, and a very interesting look. It involved low-key lighting with shadowy elements. In many cases, we do not see performers or we see only parts of individuals, parts of them. For instance, only perhaps their eyes. The rest of the face is in shadow. That's associated there with the strange highlights as well. You'll have a conversation between two people. With one person, all you see are their eyes. Then the second person who is in the conversation, perhaps all you'll see there is just their mouth moving. It's just the strange highlights that we have there. And again, the extreme camera angles high and low, and lots of distortion. Now, of course, what I have just discussed here is applied to Citizen Kane. And yet nobody would ever say that Citizen Kane is film noir. And yet the style is very much film noirish. So again, that's where we have the question of, is film noir really a genre, or is it just a style? Also discuss the production code and film noir. It is pretty much, film noir was dealing with a lot of what we'd call adult issues. Just like the hard-boiled detective crime fiction was dealing with pretty much adult issues. But film noir alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the code. Lots of affairs, lots of, well, just all kinds of nasty little things that are going on that sleazy side. They got away with it for the most part, and they got away with it through suggestion. It was a case of, okay, the censors won't let us do it, but we'll do it our way. And for the most part, they succeeded. There are also here gender issues and film noir, and one of the primary figures that we find in it is the femme fatale. These are very, very assertive women. These are women who are in control of their lives, and in many cases they end up controlling males in it. It's very much a liberating type of genre for women. In summary then, film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality. Again, they were very successful during or following the war. It's a commentary on modern mass American culture. That's best exemplified in the city environment, and on consumerism. It is on that people who live in the city are consuming. That is, they must buy their food, buy their clothes, and so forth. It's not that agrarian idea that we found in the Western. And also, it is simply disillusionment with Paradise Lost. That if America was the promised land, it very quickly, we lost it very quickly when the cities took over. So it is also a condemnation pretty much of urban life. Okay, moving on into film in the television age. Massive changes start taking place. What we find first is post-war decline in attendance. What is interesting about this statistic is in 1946 we had the highest theater attendance ever, and I think it still holds true when you adjust all the figures, for whatever inflation and things like that. Followed by the next year, the most dramatic decrease in attendance. And it wasn't just simply the threat of television. After, television was ready to go before the war. The war interrupted it and was put on hold. Right after the war, we now have an interesting thing called television, which was at that time known as radio with pictures. But it's not the only culprit when people think about what happened in this era. There was more leisure time, there was more money, and interest in other activities, and a migration to the suburbs. These things also affected attendance. As I mentioned earlier, the most popular leisure activity at this time was bowling. But television still had, the theater and movie industry still had to deal with television, and they fought it all the way, because in the early years, the early 50s, late 40s and early 50s, the studios forbade their movie actors to appear on television. And you had it 3,000 miles apart. The center of TV was New York, and the center of motion pictures was Hollywood. But eventually they began to work together when the motion picture industry suddenly discovered that TV could actually be a subsidiary market. I think this is best exemplified by Walt Disney, who was desperate for money to build his Disneyland, so he made a deal with ABC TV for a weekly TV series so that he could pay for Disneyland. And what Disney very quickly discovered was that he could promote his movies on his TV show. And it worked. Okay. The movie industry's response to the competition from television and the decline in the attendance, this time it was technical innovations. When you think about it, if you've ever seen early TV sets, you know, their screen looked like portholes in a ship. They were round. They were in black and white. They were often, very often, what you saw there was fuzzy pictures with weird wavy lines going through it. It was just pretty much not what you were accustomed to seeing if you went to a movie theater. So what they did was to improve on what you were seeing in the movie theater, and one way to do it was to get you away from the tiny screen. And they did that first with what they call Cinerama, which was a huge curved screen that allowed you to, as you sat in the theater and you had the curved screen, you were able to see peripherally. So as you sat there, you know, and you rode the roller coaster ride, it was as if you were actually in the roller coaster because things were going by on the sides and lots of people got sick and all of that sort of thing. So that was Cinerama. But of course, only certain theaters could show it because it involved a very expensive conversion. The other thing that they added was depth, 3D. So you could go to the films and have all kinds of things thrown at you. You go to a Western and you've got the Indians with their bows and arrows and they're firing arrows at you. You got a rock avalanche, things like that coming at you off the screen. So it was a very much of a trickster kind of a thing. It was gimmickry like that. And then they settled in something that they called CinemaScope, which was turning that square image wide into a rectangle. And what you got there was a standard which was which would eventually become the standard which we call widescreen, even though CinemaScope was wider. But it led to just simply a wider look. So we lost square and we got rectangle. And that's with us today when you talk about high definition television, is that what we have is the wide screen. So it set the standard. Now on my little slide here, I mentioned we've got CinemaScope and Panavision. The difference between the two is that Panavision became the standard for that very wide screen for 2.35 to 1 ratio, mainly because of the optics. The optics were better and it replaced CinemaScope, even though in the 1960s they still referred to a lot of films as shot in CinemaScope. They were actually being shot in Panavision. And when we say aspect ratio there, again, what that means is, according to our series, is the width to height of a projected image. Now, it needs to be said here, too, is that what do you do with films like this, though? Because part of what you can get your money back by releasing your films to television. After they've run their course in theaters, you put them on TV, and what you get, you're not going to be able to see that widescreen thing. So they made technical changes here in what they call panning and scanning, and then later into letterboxing. Panning and scanning was a horrible thing because you really never knew what you wondered at times why a director would shoot a film that way. And anyway, the movie discusses it. We know what letterboxing is, as be aware of what the safe action area is in filming now. Okay, we got to move on here. And we go to the creative innovations by the independent producers at this time. What they discover in the television age is that, yes, for the most part, there aren't too many adults going to the movies, but teenagers are going to the movies like crazy. And a small company called American International Pictures realizes that and begins to make films that are marketed strictly to teenagers. And of course, make a ton of money off of that. And also, the same company realizes that if you can make a lot of money if you combine teenagers with monsters. And so we have low-budget exploitation films at this time made by independent producers that are just assembling films with monsters and usually with teenagers involved. That's when we get the classic title, I Was a Teenage Werewolf, followed by I Was a Teenage Frankenstein and Teenage Monster and all of these films. But at any rate, it made a lot of money. They were boffo at the box office. Okay, the film school generation. We're really talking about the 1960s here, and what you have in the 1960s is a transition in the movie industry. It is going from the early 60s of older generation movies like a sex comedy starring Rock Hudson and Doris Day called Lover Come Back to a more graphic sex comedy at the end of the 60s in the form of The Graduate, and made for a younger generation in film audiences. So be aware of all of the cultural things that are going on at this time, such as the counterculture movement, the ideological war, Vietnam, and the generational war. That Vietnam represented a younger generation who were totally anti-war, which ended up being baby boomers versus conservative elders. The socio-political climate of the United States at the time going through upheaval, the idealism of JFK, the pragmatism of LBJ, and the race relations of MLK, and then of course ending with Nixon. And then you have university protests, and you have the nonviolent activism versus violent eruptions, the assassinations and the riots. It's a crazy era. The President of the United States is assassinated, and you get a civil rights leader gets assassinated, and a fellow running for president who happens to be the brother of the assassinated president, he gets assassinated. I mean, it boggles the mind when you think about what was going on at the time. And then you also have the National Organization of Women and the Women's Lib movement, which involves a sexual revolution. And Hollywood was right there for that sexual revolution, right there at the forefront. And, okay, all of these things here that was going on, the images of women at the time, they're either virgins or whores. That's that back and forth that goes on. You have the image of youth, college kids with half-baked ideas. The images of race, which was dealt with more directly than the images of women and youth issues. And the roots of racism are still not addressed. We have exploitation films that pick up on all of this craziness. So we have lots of sex films and films about drugs and violence and horror. Then you have blaxploitation, which everybody tries to figure out what that was, a very short-lived cycle of black action movies, such as, well, one of them was called Slaughter. I can't think of what was the main one. Shaft, and those black action movies. And then, of course, the rating system gets overhauled completely, and they allow a lot of stuff that the parents would never have thought of back in their day. And the changing face of moviegoers. They're younger, they're college educated, and they have lots of money. Okay. And the New Wave, that was the French cinema, and picked up by the American film critics. And what we have in the 1960s is people going to college to understand what movies are all about. And so you have film critics that major, crazy people like me that major in film studies. And let's see, become familiar with modern filmmakers, an example of their works. And these are Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, and also filmmakers on the fringes like Julie Dash. And the bottom line to remember is, with regard to the modern film, is that a movie just ain't a movie anymore. It's entirely something else. I'm not going to go through all of that. It's the new media. The new media is not just making a movie, but you make a movie so you can put it on cable TV uncensored, and then you censor it and put it on broadcast TV. And then you have it ready on a DVD that you can sell to the home. And that DVD is often different from what you saw in the movie, because sometimes they make it with what they call a director's cut, which runs about 10 hours longer than the movie that you saw in the theater. And so you really don't know what the movie's about, what makes for what. And also it's that diversification of the film industry. You just can't make the movie. You've got to make the movie because it costs so much that you got to have all of these ancillary things to go with it. You got to have soundtrack albums and novels based on it. You got to have toys, games, etc. It's what we called synergy. And let's see. Remember your photo ID. Remember the 3x5 note card. Remember the exam closes early on Thursday. And your extra credit is due Tuesday. That's June 10th by 10:30 a.m. If you have a paper for me, just hand it to me in my office. If I'm not there, slip it under the door and avoid the rush and take the exam early. And that's it. Good night. I think we made it. Bye, and have a great summer. Thank you. Thank you.
Lane Online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.